I taught science for 12 years, public school, middle school level, and it's a part of who I am. I don't want to turn this into a science channel, but there are some things I believe that need to be said about science because science is starting to play a new role for many people. And if I could sort of scope this out and say from the big picture, if you look at history in ancient times when we were primitive, when civilization was just getting started on the plains of Mesopotamia, political rulers, recognized and hired certain men who dressed up in priestly robes. They would then provide these people with a platform so that they could speak to the people and declare that what the rulers said and did was right according to the gods. Now, of course, we have come a long way. Those were primitive times. Nowadays, rulers recognize and hire certain men who dress up in lab coats, and they then provide these people with a platform so that they can speak to the people and declare that what the rulers are saying and doing is right according to science. You see what is happening here. Science has become, in essence, a new authority figure for people who don't recognize God anymore. And they've lost their faith in God, and the human heart is cut out. We are designed, most of us, some of us aren't, some of us are very sort of self-confident, but the majority of people, they long for an authority figure that they can trust. They're looking for an objective source of truth beyond themselves, and that the existence of that force or authority gives them some sort of peace. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not evil. It's not a bad desire. It's part of the God-shaped whole, I believe, in every human soul. So the problem isn't the desire. The problem comes when exploitative entities use this feature of human nature to enshrine themselves. And the state will always attempt to fill this longing with itself, directly and indirectly. That's what I've concluded from my studies of history. So, in the same way, science is good. And when I say that, let's define the term. Science is a procedure. It is a method of truth discovery by which one attempts to gain knowledge of the natural world. And they call this the scientific method. Or science can also mean the body of knowledge discovered by the scientific method, by using the scientific method that has been developed over a long period of time, mostly in Western Europe, and then used around the world. So that isn't bad. It's good. It helps mankind. And like I said, I taught science in public schools for 12 years. And I celebrate it for what it is, but not for what it's being sold as now. And unfortunately, many of the people who also trust science also seem to trust the state. And I would suggest they be a little more historical minded. And I'm going to argue for historical legal evidence in a little bit. But history teaches us that governments often abuse their own citizens in various ways. Government isn't bad. I'm not an anarchist. Government is good. It's meant to be good. It's meant to defend our rights and protect us from those who would violate them. But it turns into something else, and now it's being funded. Science in the modern day is being funded by the state more than ever. More than ever, science is starting to look like a copy of those ancient days in Mesopotamia, where the rulers are giving people a platform, and those that they put on the platform and put in special garments assure the people that the rulers are wise and are acting in accordance with the objective authority, whether it be the gods or science. It's turning science into a narrative instead of a procedure or body of knowledge. And that is very frightening to me. I consider it an abuse of science or done in the name of science. Just like people are doing abuses in the name of religion, they've done abuses in the name of God. The same thing can happen with science. So science is good, but those who are trying to corrupt it from a tool used to validate truth into a narrative that supports various agendas are abusing it. And so a part of that is this misconception that a lot of people have today. And they hold that, and they want to hold that misconception because in their heart, there's a good longing for an authority figure that they believe they can trust, that they believe I can go here and get objective truth. And so this is the idea, I've heard it, that, science is the only objective means we have for truth discovery. Have you heard that before? People say, well, you may say there's other methods of finding the truth, but science is the only objective method we have for truth discovery. Now, is that the case? Is that fact that science is not only science is an objective means of discovering truth, but it's the only objective means of discovering truth? I'm going to go back to a saying from the late, great Yogi Berra. Baseball guy, had a lot of good quotes. He said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is a difference. And so when done objectively, science can find objective truth. But you know what, friends? The same thing could be said of other methods of truth discovery. Mathematical proofs. If you do the math correctly, it gives you an objective method of truth discovery. Or in some cases, historical legal evidence. If the evidence is strong enough and solid enough, or even, divine revelation. If someone is saying something, God told me X and Y, and it turns out to be bogus, that doesn't mean that in theory, if God revealed something to someone, that wouldn't be objective truth. It would be objective truth. In theory, it's objective truth. In practice, it isn't. Well, guess what, folks? Scientific experiments are designed, executed, and given meaning by human beings who are anything but objective. In particular, when their funding comes from sources inextricably connected to a political state. You think politics are clean? Politics are funding science now. You think the state has crept into every area of life. You think they're funding science but not creeping into it? That's not a logical or rational thing to believe, folks. So really, in practice, science is not objective because the people designing the experiments, conducting the experiments, and saying what the experiments meant, what the results mean, they are human beings just like us. They have their biases just like us. And again, in theory, peer review and replication of findings should minimize this. And I've had people tell me this, well, in science, we have peer review and we have replication of experiments to establish that and to keep biases from interfering. That's why we're so objective in our truth. I'm going to leave a couple of links in the comment section. I probably could have found a dozen of them, but I'm going to leave one link that shows this. They study high-impact cancer studies, not a frivolous topic. Half of those in published journals could not be replicated, half of the study results. And in some fields, it's even worse. I got one in human psychology, 2/3 of those, they could not replicate the results of the study. And that's just one problem. One problem is that they assume the results can be repeated, but that's not always the case. They used the scientific method, they described their procedures, and yet the results cannot be replicated in science in America today. So the other problem is, like I said, in theory, many methods of truth discovery can be objective. But just like in the state, mostly the state can protect people's rights, but it can also violate people's rights. And in reality, the state just sort of muddles through in the middle. Sometimes it does a little of this, and sometimes it does a little of that. And so states are not governed by angels, just men. In the same way, getting a degree and wearing this lab coat, that doesn't turn scientists into angels. They're still just men with their own interests, their own blind spots, their own biases. And you say, okay, but they get other guys to check out their work. And I'm telling you, one, when they do, half the time it doesn't check. And number two, fact is, scientists, science professionals are a subculture. And it is classically true that subcultures often become ultra-conformist in their thinking within that subculture. So if you have only a handful of journals and research institutions run by people with a particular set of views about the world, then the blind spots are going to be self-reinforcing. Okay, it's peer-reviewed, but what if your peer has the same narrow views that you do? If they review your work, it's still not going to help correct that work, is it? Because the blind spot is related to a shared view about the bigger picture of things. You might as well take a group of Calvinists, and Calvinists, I'm not picking on you, I could use a lot of people with this systematic theology, but you might as well ask a group of Calvinists to find a fatal flaw with a paper when the fatal flaw is related to some flaw in Calvinism. You know, it doesn't matter if you do peer review, if your peers share the same systematic view of things and there's something about that system that is off. So, you know, in theory, science has this corrective process, and those who put a lot of trust in science as a system, they point this out. They claim science is self-correcting, religion is not self-correcting. But the reality is that a large segment of the population, including scientists themselves, are turning karma into dogma. They're getting their own dogma. And they can correct minor details. You know, they're going on course and they can do this a little bit. But ask them to go back and say, oh, wait, you need to go back here and restart because everything you've done for the last 20 years has been misguided. They're not good at that. They don't do that well. I've tried to show this. The reaction against it is visceral, really. On the one hand, people are saying, I trust science because it's self-correcting. But on the other hand, you say, look, here's scientific evidence that the scientific narrative of the last 20 years is wrong. They freak out. The reaction is visceral, not logical, not reasonable. And I've tried to show this with my video debunking the idea that Neanderthals made art and that they were so much like us, and pointing to the work of a Cambridge professor. But, you know, you're saying it can be wrong and self-corrects. Again, in theory, that's so. In practice, the scientists are offended at the idea that they've been doing stuff wrong for 20 years in their field. What, do you think we're all idiots? And then the people who want to put their trust in science, it's almost like you violated their religion to say that the science narrative for even the last 20 years has been wrong about even a small matter. Like, you know, does it really matter whether Neanderthals interbred with Eurasians and we have 1.5% of our genes from them? Not in the larger scheme of things, but still they can't accept that science, their system, they trust, that the sort of taking this place of religion could have been off for that long. You're threatening their worldview, and they don't like it. The reaction is emotional. So I would also say that, you know, we can't count on a system to work, no matter how flawed the people in that system may be, and we're all plenty flawed. And it's the same thing with government. You will never, and some wag once said something like this, but you're never going to invent a system of government that's so perfect that people don't have to be good. The system's perfect, so I don't have to be virtuous anymore, and I will still have a good government. I'll still enjoy the blessings of freedom. Doesn't work that way. The government is always going to reflect what the population deserves after a while. So we just have to understand, trusting in systems is a loser tactic. We have to get more skeptical of systems and put a premium on people who honestly look at things from multiple perspectives, who take a broad view, who are just not too smug in their thinking. And I would add that if God exists, he is the only really objective source of truth. Okay? It is, in theory, science may be an objective source of truth about the natural universe. But that's in theory. In practice, God is, in theory and in practice, if there's a God, he is the only objective source of truth, in theory and practice. But even if he gives you honest truth, it's still up to you to look at it honestly. And if you don't, you won't benefit from it. Therein lies the rub. It goes right back to the condition of our hearts, doesn't it? But the God of the Bible, isn't that just where he wants you to look? So I would also add, and it's sort of a little separate to that, but many people don't realize it about science. Science has limits to the truth that it can discover. Science operates by methodological naturalism. That is, in its methods, it assumes that only natural causes exist. I'm going to look for, in order to find natural causes, it assumes that natural causes are all that there are. So it can't test for supernatural causes. It couldn't see God if God were standing right in front of it. So it's useless for detecting God's action directly. And moreover, it is irrational for us to expect it to do so, to demand that we see scientific evidence, positive evidence for God's action. Demanding scientific proof of God's action is about as crazy as demanding supernatural proof that nature is all that there is. The best science can do in this matter is say, we don't have any natural explanation for how this happened, but we'll keep looking. And that's it. That's what science can do. If we know enough about a subject to where we ought to have an idea of what a natural explanation is, but we're still perplexed, it becomes reasonable for men to sort of rise above the tools they use, rise above methodological naturalism, and consider a supernatural explanation. Now, that supernatural explanation cannot be proven by science. All science can say is there's a gap in our knowledge. There's a hole here. And please see my video about God of the gaps and when it's a good argument and when it's not for more on that. But it can't be proven by science, but it can be reasonable based on the weakness of any and all natural explanations. When Jesus turned the water into wine, that's an example. And he did it by not even handling the elements himself. He just told people what to do with their own stuff, and he still turned water into wine. So, the historical legal method, let's talk about that for a minute and contrast it. And it's actually can be better than the scientific method when it comes to discovering truth in this certain category of events. If we're talking about a one-time historical event that left little physical trace on nature, then the historical legal method can help us determine whether things are true in a way that the scientific method cannot. For example, it is widely believed that George Washington, crossed the Delaware River and fought the Hessians. And that was one of the big turning points in the American Revolutionary War. It is celebrated. There's a famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, and we all believe it happened. But we can't prove it scientifically. But we believe it. Based on what? Based on historical legal evidence that is very sound. It isn't just a claim. It isn't just an anecdote. It's historical fact. Not only because of the witnesses of the day, but because of the reverberations that event left on history. It didn't leave physical traces on the earth, but it left physical traces in history that we can see and measure, and we can trace it back to that event. Oh, that's the turning point in the American Revolutionary War. We see after that we started winning the battles, and so on. So compare that to another claim about George Washington. George Washington, did you chop down the cherry tree? I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. We've heard that one too. Is that historical fact? We have no idea. We don't know. There isn't enough evidence. There isn't enough historical legal evidence to establish that that claim is true. So it may just be an anecdote. There is no scientific evidence. There isn't enough scientific evidence to establish either account as factual. But there's enough historical legal evidence to establish the crossing of the Delaware as fact, not the other. So there is truth from non-scientific methods. And that's something, people are just so believing in science so much, they don't realize that there are limits. There are actually things that you can get truth elsewhere that's more, that is a better tool for finding truth in that area. Now, why do I say all this on a channel that isn't really about science? I'm saying this because I'm claiming that the Christ-centered model, that's what my book is really about, the Christ-centered model for early Genesis, reconciles science and Scripture. I'm saying that. That's my claim, and it does. But it can't reconcile them in places where modern science has it wrong. And it has a lot right. There's a lot that Christians need to learn from science, in my opinion. Okay? But there's some places where the science is just making some assumptions about the rest of the nature that don't apply to man. And that's primarily the place. But again, I'm being fair because I think Christianity has had early Genesis wrong too. I'm not saying that people who look to science as their authority for objective truth need to change, and Bible-believing Christians can just continue to think that objective reality starts at their belly button. Or maybe a fair way to put it is, objective reality starts with their view of a text. And they don't distinguish between their view of a text and the text itself. But it's like I said before, God can give objective truth. We have to hear it objectively to get the truth out of it. And that's the problem. It always comes back to our heart and us. I like to say all evidence is a mirror because it tells us a lot about ourselves and not just about whatever we're studying. So, I said a while ago that it's one thing to believe a text is true, but it's another that how you see it is correct. And that if there's a God, He is the one source of objective truth. He is the most objective and complete source of objective truth. And God can give us the truth in a text, but it is still up to us to view it objectively. Well, what is objectively? Well, if there's a God and He said how to view it, that's objectively. And Christ, in John 5:46, said that Moses wrote about Him. So the one who is objective truth said how to view the text. View it like it's writing about me. And so if that's not what you see when you read early Genesis, then you're not seeing it the way Christ said to look at it. So don't just look at His Word, but look at His Word the way He said to look at His Word, that it's pointing to Him. And my friends, if you do that, you're going to be as close to objective truth on the matter as we can get this side of eternity. Thank you very much for listening, and may God bless you.